Hey everyone, Jay here. Time for another Intro to Python lab. This is lab 10 in my series, fall of 2022. Today we're talking about while loops, right? There are a couple kinds of loops. There's while loops, there's do while loops, there's for loops. Really, all the other loops are kind of built on top of the while loop. And to understand any of them, you need to understand the while loop, right? So let's talk about what a loop does and why they're important. So a loop, as its name suggests, is a block of code that will execute and then it will loop back around and continue to execute until you somehow tell it to stop. So the way the loop works is we'll have essentially an if statement at the top of the loop. And if it's true, the body of the loop will execute. If it's not true, the body of the loop will not execute. Okay. And so this is how the do while loop was invented. Sometimes you might want the loop to execute at least one time before you test that or before you fail out. And so that's the do while. It will do it once and then it will test at the end. And if it's true, it will continue to loop. And if it's false, it will stop looping, right? And you can manipulate that value to be true precisely when you want it to be true. So I have some simple examples here today to kind of give you an idea of how to build them, right? Oftentimes we'll use numbers. We'll say while such and such a number is less than 10, keep looping, and then maybe it starts at 0 and we count up to 10, and then when it stops being less than 10, we'll finish the loop and it will run 10 times maybe, right? Or we could even start from a negative number, or we could start from anything and we could finish at any number, right? So oftentimes we'll have a loop with a number. If you have a specific number, you might want to create a for loop. A for loop you pre-program. You give it a starting point and an end point, and it will loop through that thing. There's a lot of powerful things you can do with for loops in Python, but that's for another lab. For this lab, we'll just look at a couple of options that we can do with a while loop to kind of get you thinking perhaps a little outside of the box. Very simply though. So my first loop, real simple, this is the whole loop right here. I have an initial input value, okay? I'm going to get some input from the user and I'm going to loop repeatedly until the user inputs something that I'm specifically looking for. Okay, so my input value starts as the letter Y, and my loop will test is input value equal to Y, either lowercase or uppercase, okay? I care about both. If it's equal to either lowercase or uppercase y, it's going to continue to loop, and every time it loops, it's going to ask the user to input y to continue looping. And if they input anything else, it won't loop anymore because it will stop being lowercase y or uppercase y. Okay? And then it will print loop exited when it indeed does. And so this will just keep looping as long as the user inputs y, it will loop, 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 loop until that stops being true. Okay, now a little outside the box. So far we've said, okay, well, this is true, let's keep looping. Well, we can also introduce a not. We can say, I'm going to start my input value as y again, and I'm going to say while my input value is not equal to n, lowercase or uppercase, right? If it's anything but n, keep looping. And once the user puts an n for their input, I'm going to ask them, please input n to stop, and it will keep looping. So they can keep inputting y to go, or they can put literally anything to keep looping. And once they input that n, they will stop. So these are essentially they're the same loop, right? If they input y, they keep looping. If they input n, they stop looping. However, on the first one, if they input anything other than y, they stop. And on the second one, if they input anything other than n, they keep going, right? So while yes for y, or while not no, on the second one, right? So they're very opposite. They kind of essentially perform the same thing, but there's a very different way of thinking about them and a different way of getting that input and what those inputs could be, okay? It's not always just simple Y for yes, N for no. I could have wrote the whole long thing and said, if the input value is Y, keep looping. If it's N, stop looping. And what if it's anything else, then what do I do? Is there a third option? There's not exactly a third option here, right? So these are these two. And if you're doing my lab, please copy these down. Right? This is what you want to put in here. And I have two more. I've introduced a second value, one for the input and one for the control. So now I've said my input is going to be a number this time, and my loop control is a simple true-false value, right? It's equal to true. So while loop control continues to be true, it's going to loop. It's going to do a little bit more this time. This time I'm going to get an input value. I'm going to say, please input 1 to continue looping. Then I have some actual code in here. If my input value is numeric, first I want to test that they did input a number. Okay, and the isNumeric function that's built into Python is a property of text of a string. Okay, so a string value dot isNumeric. Don't forget your parentheses. That's the syntax here. All this. If that is true, and I can turn it into an integer with the casting that we've done before. The order of this is very important. Remember, in our if statements with the and, these can short circuit, okay? And remember what short circuiting is, right? If the first one is false, then we won't test the second one because it's an and. We know that if the first one's false, the whole thing altogether will be false because you can't have false on one side and still come out true. So if it's not numeric and I try to cast as an integer, that's going to throw an error and crash my program. But because I put this on the right-hand side of my and, if it's not numeric, it's not even going to do that part of the if statement, okay? So if it is numeric, then I will continue on and test if it's equal to 1. Okay, I'll cast it as an integer with this side and then see if that result is equal to the number 1. If all that is true, I'm going to pass. And what is pass? It's for if statements. It's kind of specific to Python. It is because of the syntax in Python where everything is tabbed over. Okay, every time I come in here, I have a tab over. Because of the Python syntax, you can't just leave a blank in an if statement here. So they invented the pass statement, which lets me do nothing but carry on as if the program is running normally. So I could write a comment in here and just say do nothing. Okay, if all this is true, if the user input number 1, then do nothing. And we're inside the loop, so do nothing means continue looping. If they did not enter 1, the else, I'm going to set the loop control to false. Okay, so in our first pair of while loops, we got the user input and we tested it directly in the loop. If it was Y, we kept looping. If it was N, we stopped looping. And then there's some variation in what we did when they put other inputs. In this one, the loop control is a simple true false, and now we are getting some input while we're performing a task, and depending on the result of that task, we're changing the loop control. Okay, so this adds a little bit of complexity to it, and you're often going to do this. You're not simply going to test the loop control itself. You're going to set the loop control based on some other function, some other code that we write. Okay, so this is going to get you in the mindset of doing something, and then based on the result, we may or may not exit the loop. Okay, And the result of all this will determine whether we need to just keep looping or exit out by setting the loop control to false. Okay. Sometimes if I'm writing a really big loop for the whole program, perhaps I want the whole program to be in a loop, I will make my loop control value called game over, and I will loop as long as while not game over. And then at some point I'll set game over to true based on some input or something, and then the loop will stop. So this one here continues looping as long as the user inputs 1. If they input anything other than 1, letters or numbers, then it will be false and it will exit out the loop. And you probably can guess that the next loop I wrote is going to continue looping as long as the user does not input a number 2 for exiting, right? Just like we did before. This time, if they input a 2, right here, then we're going to set the loop control to false and exit. And if they input literally anything else, we're going to not change the loop control at all, and we'll continue looping. All right. So that's it. That's your entire lab for intro to loops, okay, in Python. And let's go ahead and run this and see some of the output. There we go. Let me put my screen up a little bit so you can see more of the output area. And we'll run this. Okay, it says please press Y to continue looping. Remember that first loop? We're checking for Y. We don't care about anything else. So I'm going to write a L, loop exited, right? I didn't write N to exit. If it was anything other than Y, it would stop. Please input N to stop looping. We're in that second loop now. I'm going to put an L again. It's not an N, so it keeps looping, right? I'm going to try Y. Also keeps looping. And we'll put an N, and it stopped. Now we've entered the third loop. Please input a 1 to continue looping. We'll try an L again. And it looks like a 1. And it exited, okay? It was not 1. It's the only one we were looking for. So let's exit. Now we're in the last of the 4 loops. Please input a 2 to stop looping. So I'll do an L again. It's not a 2, so it will keep looping. I'll do an N. Nope. I'll do a 1. Keep looping still. I'll do a 3. Nope. And I'll do a 2. And loop exited. Okay. So the 4 loops, anything other than Y will exit. Anything other than N will continue. Only N can exit. Anything other than a 1 will exit. And then last, anything other than a 2 will continue. And a 2 will exit. Okay, so a couple different ways of thinking about how to make the loop. Let's have a look back at really quick what we did. All right. We made a loop while something is true. We're going to keep looping. We made another loop while something is not false. We're going to keep looping. We made another loop where we were looking for a value, and then we modified a control variable to either continue or exit looping. And then in the last one, we did the same thing, but we flipped the script again. And instead of looking for the exit value, or instead of looking for the continue value, we're looking for the exit value. Okay, so we can do both things. We can go each way, right? All right, that is our lab here. And give you another look at the code real quick. Again, don't forget to include your shebang and your comments at the top. A couple more labs, we'll start doing functions, and we'll have more information to include in every file at the top and at the bottom. All right, so here's all the code. Pause and write it down. All right, that's it for this lab. Again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.